We are not live yet.
Okay. Must be
You
something.
haven't had your little phone vibration?
I've got it.
Was having technical
I've
difficulties.
got it on the side over here.
Broadcast.
Yeah.
But I just made her an attendee and she is good now. So we are recording and we're on YouTube.
We're recording. Okay, so welcome to the May 12th, 2020 meeting of the planning board, the Auburn Maine planning board, that is. I'd like to start with roll call for planning board members that are here. We'll go in alpha.
Evan Sear.
John Engler.
Matthew Duval.
Stephen Martelli.
And Riley Bergeron is present or will be soon. Riley is, and we'll just bring him in when he comes. Our first item is we have 4 of us here, which is just barely quorum, but I understand we have to vote. On that, we can be quorum if we vote unanimously on that fact. So in order to do that, I would look for a motion to do just that.
Well, given the circumstances with COVID, I make a motion that we accept 4 as quorum, and hopefully Riley will join soon anyway.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
Megan, you want to?
Yeah. Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Engler,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes. Okay, so the first item after roll call is the minutes. So if you received the printed packet, they were in that. If not, they were on the website. So comments, questions, motions?
I make a motion to accept.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Engler,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes. All right, the next item on our agenda. Oh, good. Mr. Bergeron has joined us. Mr. Bergeron, can you do your roll call? And
Yes.
then,
I am gonna have to go retrieve my dog though in a minute.
okay. So can you just state your name?
Riley Bergeron, present.
Okay, and then as an associate member, normally you wouldn't be able to vote, but there's room for you to, you'll be acting, since we are missing full members, you'll be serving as an acting member of the planning board, a full member tonight. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so our next item on the agenda is to hear from City Manager Phil Kroll, where he's going to give us an update on the capital improvement plan for the city.
Thank you, Chairman and planning board members. Appreciate the opportunity to come and present. It's good to see everyone, even though it's by Zoom. You have received in your packets the CIP FY21 plan, as well as our 5-year plan. What I thought I could do is just briefly review with you some of the highlights anyway that Economic Development and Planning has submitted for CIP. Obviously, we can discuss any of these items if you'd like. Megan, could you make that a little larger? Is that possible? Yeah, that's better. Thanks. So what I'd like to highlight to start with would be the, Megan, actually, you know what? I think if you were to unshare, and then I will share what I have, if that's possible. Might be easier, so then I can just scroll through. I just had some of the
lost him.
Looks like we did. I'm sure he'll be right back. He's rejoining now. Just as a note, Chairman Duval, we have two members of the public, Alan Kinnerson, who's interested in the backlots ordinance, and Henry Barrett, who has been involved with the solar ordinance and is part of a proposed project for June.
Okay, great, thank you.
Am I back?
You are.
You're back.
Not sure why I did that. I clicked over to share the document and then it's put me at a spin of rejoining. So, so this one here just has some highlights, and I thought I could just kind of run down through some of these. If you've been watching any of the city council meetings, I know you all have plenty of things to do, but there's been a lot of discussion regarding redevelopment of our downtown area. So there's been focus on ensuring that we have the appropriate funding that's available for dangerous building demolition, acquisition of property that's within the comprehensive plan, and then also our downtown vision. We have currently allocated $100,000 for each one of these. At last night's city council meeting, the mayor did propose for the council to consider adding an additional $800,000 in the CIP for the downtown vision. That's right now just a recommendation that he has made. There's no, no motion that's been made by the council to do that. They will have that opportunity in the upcoming meeting. But with that 800,000, the 100,000 that's being requested for the FY21 bond, there's an additional $100,000 that was set aside for the Great Falls vision from the FY20 bond. So that would leave about $1 million that's set aside. The purpose on that is to really try to focus on establishing anchors within our downtown, working with businesses that we've identified at least 4 areas within the downtown that we know that we need to try to focus on and bring development to. These funds would be able to use for that and for other larger scale development, economic development. Michael Chamings, the director, and Eric Cousins is working on a conceptual plan to present to the council on May 18th. So you can just anticipate that that will be coming soon. The other areas that I thought would be important to talk about is regarding our other funds. These are our TIF funds and CDBG funds. You all have been very much aware and part of the process for the new Auburn Village Center revitalization. There's $100,000 that's being requested for that. And then 135,000 out of TIF and out of CDBG for the downtown parking and walkability. That continues to be a primary focus for us, from everywhere from the library coming down through Main Street, and also focusing on within the downtown area. The fourth item within the other funds is the Main Avenue South Goff Street development. For those who've been on the board for any time, you may be aware of this. Evan, I'm sure you are. This was an item that was in the capital improvement funds several years ago. And this is really as it pertains to the area where the old police station is and the Lung Suite building. To really bring any development into that area, one of the recommendations were to do something with that South Goff connector to Minot Avenue at Elm Street. And these funds are allocated to work towards getting that back in alignment with getting development there. Those are the areas that are primarily related to the economic development. Obviously, we have several other engineering that I can go through. I think you've had an opportunity to take a look at all of those, and other reconstruction projects like at the airport. I can answer any questions for this, and probably before we move to questions, one thing I would want to share with you is just related to the 5-year plan. These are items that have been in the plan. Some have been in the plan for a while, and they may just continue to be not listed as a priority. We really are trying to keep our capital expenditures at that around that $9 million mark. Currently, it's at 9.5. The other funds brings it up over 10 million when we look at the other funds, but those will not be going out to bond. It would just be the one for FY21 that we'd be submitting, which is about 9.5, if that's what the council approves. Again, the council will be taking a look at this, and they may add, make the mayor's recommendation of adding the additional 800, or they could make some reductions with other capital requests that were submitted by other departments. From economic development and planning, though, the intermodal facility upgrades has been an item that's been on CIP request now for a couple of years. That's still being pushed off. That'll be pushed off to come back before the council again in FY22. That's not part of the city manager's recommendation. However, a councilor could make that recommendation to move that forward in the upcoming budget. $50,000 for the rail study. Again, that was submitted for FY21, but it will be pushed out to FY22 for potential coming back before the council. The New Auburn Village Center revitalization, there's still $100,000 being requested in the CIP plan for year 2 and year 3 of the plan. So FY22 to FY23. The comprehensive plan program, the plan is showing after this year about $400,000 for the next 4 years to be allocated to work towards that. I encourage you, if you haven't taken a look at this, I believe it was last fall, we really worked on the comprehensive plan, broke that into a document that I think is a lot more easier to read, to follow, to be able to see what's been accomplished. Updates have been added, and that's on our hub site within our website. So you should take a look at that. It's really been broken out really well. Rosemary Mosier, who is our GIS analyst, was able to work on that for us and be able to really identify that. Now that it's in that form, you can really see what's been accomplished, what progress has been made, and what areas do we really need to move forward. And I think there's over, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's at least 250 plus action steps within the comprehensive plan.
Yes, and we have a lot of new board members since that was done, but it looks like the council wants to do a comprehensive plan update in the coming year, so we'll be using that as a starting point with the board and with the council to identify the areas that need to be updated.
Yeah. So that will be really focusing on certain areas of the comprehensive plan, but not one option would have been to just start fresh. And so the council has chosen to take what we have and continue building on that and add any new projects that we need to. So there is additional money that's set aside moving forward in that, as well as the downtown vision. In the past, or in the CIP plan, it was listed at Great Falls. The council decided to call that downtown vision redevelopment, so that it can be more than just in our Great Falls area. And then the last item probably to mention is the downtown parking and walkability. Again, year 2 of that 5-year plan was another $200,000 in on that project. The documents you received have detail sheets for each one of those. On that original page that I showed you has corresponding page numbers, so you can look at that page number, go to it, and actually see the detail sheet. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll be willing to answer any questions you have regarding CIP. And obviously, if you have, there are certain projects that are in here for other departments. If you got questions for those, I'll be happy to answer them. But that's primarily the areas of focus.
Okay, great, thank you. So at this point, we'll open it up to the planning board to ask any questions. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, Phil, I've got several questions for you. What is the tax rate before you add in this $800,000, and what is it after that 800,000? Does that make a big difference?
So yeah, good question, Steve. I think for those who may not know, whatever is added into the CIP this year, it will not hit this year's tax rate. It would be in a future year.
All right.
So CIP, the debt service for that bond does not come in until wouldn't be coming into FY22. So when it comes to that amount, I think somewhere's around, if that's added, it's roughly around $80,000 that'd be added to the debt service if that $800,000 is brought in.
All right. The new Auburn area, you said that you had $100,000 for this year. Is that going to be enough to finish the park and everything else, or?
I'll look to Eric for that. Eric's been, as you know, directly involved in that.
All right.
Yeah, so it will be enough to finish what was identified in bid as phase one. It'll get the bell tower standing. It will leave the road and the configuration that's there, pretty much there right now, but it'll finish out that entire park space. And then we have a little over $100,000 left in that budget, plus we're getting reimbursed $246,000 from the Northern Borders Regional Commission grant. So we're going to have between $350,000 and $400,000 in that budget to work on the next phase.
All right, good.
In that downtown vision money and comprehensive plan implementation, those items will most likely have to go back to the council, but they could prioritize those towards any projects in the downtown, including New Auburn.
All right, very good. Phil, another thing, you said that the comprehensive plan, you're going to start with a brand new one, and is that going to take all the way back to 1995 and clear everything out?
No, I maybe misunderstood, but the council has decided not to start with a brand new comprehensive plan. It's going to continue building off what we have currently,
Okay.
and then adding any new adjustments that we need to make.
All right. All right, very good. Thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Kroll? Okay, seeing one, I have none. Seeing none others, I have one. So when you talk about the downtown, has City Council decided on what that is actually geographically?
So that's something that we want to make sure is very clear, but we also want to make sure that we have some flexibility with that. Obviously, if there's a project that comes in that can be directly tied to that downtown area, we want to make sure we have the flexibility to do that. The council has, over the years, determined downtown. We had, you can go back to the 1998 downtown master plan and take a look at what that planning included. And it was primarily Main Street, probably all the way through to past the wall on Main Street to Newbury and Laurel area, and down towards Great Falls Plaza. So that was the 1998 plan. The new plan is really to encompass the gateways coming in from Riverside Drive, from the Peace Bridge to the Main Street and Great Falls Plaza, and then also going up. So if you think about Turner Street as it goes to Turner Center and the bypass, all the way down Union Street through Minot Avenue all the way to Academy coming down, and then down to Main Street, and then connecting over and including some of the streets right off from Broad. That's the general area. We've been having some conversations internally as recent as today about ensuring that we're including some other primary locations that we already have identified that we want to make sure is part of that in case there's some future development.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Sear?
Hi, yeah, Phil, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. So, one question for my own edification. So, the capital improvements plans are used by different municipalities in many different ways. Auburn tends to add some things that other municipalities might not put on their CIP plans, but of course that's our prerogative. My question though about the CIP plan is, what is Auburn's threshold? Most municipalities seem to use a dollar amount or a sort of life of service with regard to hard capital improvements. So, like, I ask only because I'm looking through the list that seemed to run sort of from a few $1,000s all the way up.
Yeah, so good question. So yeah, I think every municipality has a different approach to their capital planning. And, you know, for Auburn, we really tried. So if you look at what do we try to submit, we try to submit as close to as possible as what we're also retiring. I think that Auburn, we did a comparison with other municipalities probably about a year or two ago, Auburn really has very low debt compared to most municipalities, and we've been maintaining that as debt gets retired is basically where we're averaging on what we submit. I mean, that can be anywhere between $8 to $10 million is what we typically bond. Some years we've been able to bring it down, and then there's been some years where to catch up on some road projects, the council a few years ago said let's add $2 million just so that we can catch up on some road projects, which brought us up to $10 million. So that's an area where we're trying to stay focused on. As far as items, the real goal here, we really are trying to work towards incorporating what should really be operating capital out of the bond funds and into the budget. We did that. If you look at the operating budget, you'll see several line items that say capital, but they're in the operating budget. We're going to continue trying to do that moving forward. There's certain items that don't have a life expectancy of 10 years. That's really the threshold that we look at. And so if it's less than 10, it really shouldn't be in a CIP. And we do try to ensure that nothing less than $10,000 is within the CIP as well. But those are some of the minimum thresholds that we try to focus on. You'll notice that we have vehicles in there. We've gone back and forth in that over my 28 years with the city. Sometimes we've done everything from not putting them in there and leasing them, and then the lease is out of your operating budget. And then in the years past, we've had 100% of the vehicles that are replaced come out of operating, and then in some years where things are more difficult, it shifts into capital. But we probably go back and forth on that every 5 years, depending on what's happening, throughout the entire city and with the operating budget. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And actually, I'm glad you brought up the change in the budget. I was happy to see that.
Yes.
Several years ago, that was one of our gripes, was that there were capital improvement items, but it seemed to be a laundry list of just departmental expenditure. So
so within those department budgets, you might see like now small equipment. Those used to be in a capital bond, and they're not in there anymore. In the operating budget, and then we'll continue moving that and shifting those moving forward.
And before I go any further, Chairman Duval, are we planning to have a feedback phase regarding the CIP? Should we be doing that now, or is this strictly questions?
I don't know. This was added today, so I know about as much about this as you do. And I've never. This is, as you know, this is my first time through this process, so I don't have an opinion about this. If you or anyone else has suggestions about how we do that, I would appreciate hearing them.
I did speak with Peter about that, and Phil as well.
Hey.
if the board has any specific recommendations tonight, that's great, but I know it's a lot to digest in one day. We could accept emailed comments as late as Monday.
Okay.
And I guess I would add too, if need be, if something, you know, you wanted to include later, you know, there's still a first and second reading coming up for the council. But I think if you want to put a collective comments to the council, like Eric said, Monday would be best.
Okay. So if anyone has comments to make now, I think we can do that. If not, we can just make sure we send things in by Monday.
May I make
Please.
some comment? Well, first of all, I'm going to reiterate something that the planning board has said in the past, which is it's difficult for us to provide meaningful feedback on the CIP when we get it this late in the game. I personally would hesitate to offer any specific item that should make it into the CIP at this point, only because it's really been worked on. I understand that the council will still be discussing it, but they're not discussing it in sort of its infancy at this point. So I'm going to reiterate what the board has mentioned in years past, which is it would be nice to see the proposed CIP before it becomes a final draft. And as a planning board member, I'm going to just say that I think in looking through the plan, nothing jumped out at me as sort of egregious. But what I did notice was that even on the fact sheet, justifications are given, and they're reasonable. In order for me to give better feedback as a planning board member, I would like to see why staff is putting, and when it comes to other departments, they can do whatever they want, but specifically CIP items for the planning department, how they're relating to the strategic plan, the goals that the planning board has set out in the previous year, how it's aligned to specific development goals. For instance, we talked about the CIP item regarding downtown, right? And so the mayor's talking about adding additional funds to that, and that sounds really great. But as a plan, it doesn't lend itself to us giving really meaningful feedback to staff or the council regarding what we think we'll need or what kind of things we think we could add to that process. So those are really for future items, not for the CIP, but looking ahead.
Evan, that's great feedback, and I appreciate that. And I think moving forward, I think what might be beneficial too is as the department is submitting their CIP or developing their CIP, it might be good for them to have a conversation with the planning board prior to that submittal to the city manager. We've had the proposed CIP probably on the website since April 9th. And I would just add that I would encourage you to go on the website under the budget tab, and you're going to see a CIP presentation that's on there. And every one of these items that are part of this CIP plan or proposal for FY21 is tied to every strategic goal that it aligns with. So if you go through, you'll be able to look at each strategic goal that we have, the 11 recommendations, and any CIP item that relates to that is tied to that heading. So it's a good PowerPoint. I almost showed it tonight, but I thought it might be best just to hit the line items. But I would encourage you to take a look at that and see how they do align with the strategic plan. As you know, we really, and Evan, you were part of that project with us. We really want the strategic plan to be a living document for the city. It's our roadmap moving forward. I think a lot of great work from close to 200 citizens and staff participated in that process, and we see that as a great document moving forward. The council references it nearly every meeting they have as how does this pertain to our strategic plan, as well as some of our budget items that are coming forward. So that's a great comment. I'm glad you mentioned the strategic plan, and I'd encourage you to go to the website and take a look at it.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else for Mr. Kroll?
I
Thanks
think
for
with
having
the,
me. I appreciate it. I'm sorry.
I have a question, but I think it'd be something I could probably just send in an email before Monday, so it can go before the council. Is that because I just also am getting a look through some of this stuff, and I am coming up with a couple of questions. But is that something I could send in an email to you, Matt, or?
So I wonder this hit us all today. It hit me in the middle, I don't know what time, Megan, you sent your email, but it was in the middle of a work day. I have had no chance to look at any of this stuff. I wonder if it's worth the planning board taking some time to actually look at the presentation that Mr. Kroll is talking about, look through the strategic plan and look through this proposal, and then make some comments after that.
I think that would be reasonable if we were working under a different timeline. I guess that goes back to my original comment with regard to seeing items ahead of time.
No, I very much appreciated that comment, and I was completely unaware until you mentioned about 5 minutes ago that I thought this was a presentation. So if other members of the planning board agree, then I think that would be actually something that we should do. I don't know whether we need to move to have a motion to actually do that, or whether we can just all agree to schedule something.
I don't know if it would be possible to have a workshop again later, either this week or Monday, I guess would be tight for the council process. But
If it could be done this week, would it be something that would be, as long as it's before Monday?
I think that would be fine, Phil, if we were able to get together again. I don't know how we can this week, actually, with the other stuff that's scheduled. But and we can certainly try to get it to you sooner in future years. This has been an odd year, and honestly, it's been very difficult to try to keep as many balls in the air as we have in the air. And
I imagine.
Pushed back.
Yeah, I completely understand that. I just, in some ways, don't actually understand why we're even hearing about it, because we can all individually, I think, try and look through this and provide some commentary, but I think it's much more useful for us as a board to have some conversations. And given this time frame, we just are completely unable to. So.
Yeah, we're required to submit it to the planning board for comment as part of the planning board ordinance.
Well, yeah, my comment is no comment. I don't know what other people have at this point. So I guess we should send comments to city staff probably. Is that correct?
Phil, should they use the comments at auburnmaine.gov email to keep them all in one place?
Actually, that would be ideal. And then that way there we can keep them there. They become a public record. It's on the website. So your questions will be available to the entire public to be able to see, or not just questions, but comments. So.
And I think the comment on process is something that, if that's in there, we can make sure that's a part of the process next year, earlier in the year.
Yeah, and just so you know, we're going to be doing a charter review. That charter and ordinance, it also includes ordinances. I know this is one area that I've highlighted and set aside as probably needs to be looked at and probably be a little more, some clarity to what's really expected of the planning board. My thought is that I think it's good to have you involved in that process, but it needs to be earlier on and not just for comments for the council to consider after the CIP has been submitted. So we have that flagged as an area that we would put towards, depending on what how the review happens, if it's a charter commission or if it's just a selective ordinance review. But during that process, we'll be sure to highlight that, as this is an area that the committee would probably need to take a look at.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks for all the work you do.
Yep.
And just so the group knows too, there'll be a appointment committee meeting tomorrow with the city council. We have several applications for planning board that'll be coming up for review and consideration, and then to the city council on the 18th for voting. And John, if I don't see you, thanks for your service that you've done on the board. I understand you might be moving, so appreciate the time that you've had on the board and the work that we've done together.
I have a lightsaber for you, John, when you head over to the dark side. That was given to me by Lewiston staff before I came over here. So
Thanks, everyone.
You're muted, John.
Thank you. Thanks for calling that out. Yes, I will still be a business owner in Auburn, so you guys won't be completely random.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you all. So if I could ask staff to actually send the information to the planning board about that email address once again, and then also some maybe website pointers to some of the materials that Mr. Kroll was talking about early this week, that would, I think, facilitate us actually doing the work that we need to do. So thank you very much.
yeah, and sorry for getting it to you so lately.
All right, next on our agenda is a public hearing. Solar, let me get the right words. Review of the draft ordinance language on solar energy generating systems in the ag resource protection zone. So we'll start with staff.
So included in your packets for this month is a staff report and 2 draft ordinances that address the comments that were raised by the planning board and the Conservation Commission at the March meetings. There's 2 options for the ordinance that you'll see in your packets. The first is the way that it has been presented, which is using the standalone Chapter 60 ordinance and incorporating the ag zone specific standards into that one ordinance. The second option is including all of the requirements for solar that are specific to the ag zone under the ag zone special exception standards. And those standards would refer back to the solar ordinance, so that all of the standards for the industrial district would also apply in the ag zone. As we discussed in the staff report, we have a little bit of a push to try and get an ordinance in place for developers to get on the June 9th planning board agenda to meet the PUC deadline that's July for approved shovel-ready projects. We discussed this timeline in the staff report, and I think the best way to go through the draft ordinance is to follow the same process that we did last time, go through each of the 8 sections where there's still some questions and try to address them. So the first discussion item that we have are the lot coverage standards. The Conservation Commission wanted to see some vegetation and compaction definitions in relation to the impervious areas. So we provided a definition, that item that's over there in italicized, for permanent stabilization. We pulled this definition from Chapter 500, the main stormwater rules, and we thought it covered vegetation and compaction pretty well without coming up with a new definition that may deviate from how DEP looks at that. The Conservation Commission also wanted to look into using the surface area of the solar panels for that impervious calculation. The planning board was curious how this would look. So we looked into this, and a lot of communities use about 20 to 30% for lot coverage standards on ag land, but most just reference the impervious areas such as the mounting blocks and access roads, which is what we've already done for the industrial district. So our thoughts are that if we get into measuring impervious area using the panel surface, we wouldn't be consistent with DEP's measurements. And the solar projects could potentially consume more acreage overall because they'd have to meet a more stringent lot coverage standard and still have to generate the 20 megawatts or so of power that they need to make the project feasible. So I guess I'd like to turn it over to the planning board to get your thoughts on what we have here for the lot coverage standards before we move on to the next section, total plot area.
Okay, thank you, Megan. And I see that Mr. Sear has his hand raised. Yes.
Yeah, of course I have my hand raised.
Always a comment.
Yeah, when it comes to the lot coverage, I think it gets tricky because you were talking about the sort of the pilings that they're sitting on and then the impervious area. One of the things that we had talked about early on in the process was sort of thinking about it as a building envelope, like a project envelope, such that a perimeter boundary around the proposed project represented the lot coverage. That sort of just seemed to go away in this process, and I'm wondering, did that go away because you weren't finding any other municipalities using a system like that? Was it because it's cumbersome to use a system like that? Why was that sort of left behind?
I didn't find examples of that with other communities. I'm trying to remember was that something that we talked about for the ag zone, or was it for industrial district?
We had talked about it in the industrial zone,
Okay.
and it had come up again briefly in the ag zone as what if we just looked at in the way we look at, say, like a building envelope, right?
So in a way, it's related to the actual panel area calculation, right? Except you take into account that the panels are tilted, but it's the same idea. You, instead of looking at just how much land the mounts cover, you look at how much land the project covers. Is that right, Mr. Sear?
Right. So and that would include spaces in between panels and everything inside that perimeter, the perimeter that's drawn. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the items that I had in my notes about that was the fear that solar projects may take up more land area overall if we look at them that way, as opposed to just looking at the mounting blocks. So I thought maybe we were steering away from that, looking at it that way, but if the planning board wants to change that, then we can certainly come up with language for that.
I can understand that concern, but I guess it only becomes a concern if, I guess to me, it comes down to which one would be easier to define and measure.
Well,
if we say 30% of lot coverage is paved and mounting block areas, that still equates to a project size that's much more than actually 30% of the lot size.
You're right.
Or we could say, it can't cover more than the building envelope for the project can't cover more than, 80% of the lot. And that might in and of itself equate back to 20 to 30% if you were only measuring the mounting blocks and the paving. I guess my question is, which one is easier, more readily understood, less burdensome?
I think we stuck with the impervious area because we're using it in the industrial district, and it's how DEP is measuring impervious area for projects.
Okay.
You can certainly deviate from that in the ag zone, but for
No, I think it makes sense to create consistency. That's fine. That was just my question about that.
yeah.
Mr. Bergeron?
Well, that's what I was wondering was, since we're considering it for the ag zone, isn't the real consideration the soils or what could be of the soils? So I think that the base of the mountain or whatever would be more impactful on the land use than the array would be, because the array doesn't absorb the water. It would run off back onto the land, but the mount itself would make it so that soils directly underneath it would not be absorbing any water. So that's why it seems like it makes sense. I guess there wasn't really a question.
Yes, Mr. Engler?
Question for staff. So would these projects not have some kind of CAD files or other kind of design file that would enable staff to make the calculation relatively easily, no matter how we define the metric, or is that incorrect?
So we don't usually get CAD files. I know that our GIS staff person likes to get CAD files to update the mapping, but we usually get those calculations provided by the applicants. So when they fill out their development review application, they have to provide how much impervious area they're using on the site, what the total acreage is, and sometimes it's like, for example, the BD solar project was split between Auburn and Poland, so they had to give us that information just for Auburn. So we rely on them to provide that to them. We don't necessarily go and check the CAD file calculations ourselves.
So I guess I have a question related to this then about lot buffers. So if we are considering a building envelope, we're essentially talking about buffers around, if we're considering that type of model, we're essentially then talking about buffers within the land. So there's a maximum amount of the lot that can be covered by a solar array. I wonder if you took a piece of property and you mounted solar on it from edge to edge, you put an array on it, you completely covered it, what percent would be covered by the impervious area taken up by the mounts for the solar panels? Do we have any idea of that number?
The example that we were looking at was the BD solar project, and that was under the 30% impervious area threshold, and those were pretty much wall-to-wall solar panels. If I had the plan, I would pull it up, but they had wetland areas that they were trying to avoid, so those kind of compensated a little bit, but it did certainly take up a lot of the lot.
Right. So
Matthew, that might be something that Henry Barrett could speak to. He is online as an attendee and is a solar developer.
okay, would the planning board want to hear from him on this? Anybody not want to hear from him on this?
I think as an example, if you had a 4x8 panel with a less than a 1 foot square post, then you're talking one square foot of impervious or less for every 32 square feet of panel.
Right. So in essence, with what I was trying to get at is that the 30% lot coverage using the mounts as impervious surface is unreachable. It's an unreachable number. You can never be exceeded.
Especially with setbacks and any buffering requirements.
Exactly. So then the question for me becomes, do we want in any way to limit the amount of, like, do we want to think about setbacks, buffers, etc., with relation to solar or not?
Well, in my mind, I think it's less about the setbacks and the buffers. Those will exist no matter what. So no matter how many solar panels are on site, they can only get within a certain distance of the lot lines, within a certain distance of delineated wetlands, so on and so forth.
Yep.
The question really becomes, is the planning board, do we want to say that a project can only take up, say, 50 to 60% of the entire area of a lot? Or are we okay with saying that a solar array system can always take up 100% of the usable space on the lot? Because as Mr. Duval pointed out, they will never exceed the 20% or 30% coverage. So if they're on a nice flat lot with no sort of internal wetlands or other sort of hazards, let's say, they could cover the entirety of the interior of the lot up to the setback lines and still not exceed the coverage standard. So that's, in my mind, what the question is here.
Yeah, I think thank you for summarizing. That's exactly what I was trying to get at, is does the planning board want to actually think about total coverage, or does the planning board want to allow maximum coverage for solar panel arrays?
And if it's helpful, I think during the industrial district discussions when we talked about this, I think we heard from Henry Barrett from Nexamp, and they had mentioned that the solar arrays themselves don't necessarily degrade the land underneath them. So it's almost beneficial in a way to have them there to protect the land that's underneath them, as long as it's not compacted and remains vegetated. So I think that's why we kind of went in that direction for the industrial district ordinance. But I do remember that as part of that discussion initially when we were trying to think of how we wanted to define impervious area.
Yep, Mr. Engler?
Yeah, just tying into the discussion from last time, or maybe it was 2 meetings ago, for land clearing. And if we want it to be effective, then I actually don't see any reason why we wouldn't open 100% of the lot, given the buffers and everything.
Yes, Mr. Bergeron?
I missed the very beginning of what you said, Mr. Angler, but I think I got the gist of it. But that's kind of was my question, is if it's replacing agriculture, wouldn't we want the developer to be able to picture the solar arrays like a crop and use as much of the land as he could to harvest the sun, as long as it was abiding by the wetland buffers and the setback buffers and any reflection buffers?
Mr. Martelli?
I think that what you have to look at is that the solar panels in 20, 25 years can be removed and that land can be used again. Think of it as a land bank instead of a permanent structure. You understand what I'm saying?
I do. Yes, Mr. Sear?
Yeah, so I'm processing sort of the question at hand. And I think Mr. Engler sort of brings up an interesting point. One of the advantages we said to doing this in the ag zone was that we could reclaim some of the land that has become forested. I guess in thinking about it, it would make more financial sense for a developer to clear forested land, which is expensive to do, if they were allowed to put more solar panels in that space, right? So it wouldn't make sense to clear a lot of, say, low value trees to only be able to cover, say, half of what you've cleared with the solar panels. It might not be worth their while. And I'm not trying to advocate for one side or the other here. I'm saying this is clearly a question in front of us, and we have to go one direction or the other. Just trying to think about what are some of the second order consequences of going in either direction. So, but I think Mr. Engler sort of brings up an important point there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. In Mr. Sear, in comment to your last, related to your last comment, I think if I was a developer and clearing land, I would only clear the portion that I could develop rather than the whole thing, if that made sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Cousins.
I don't think I can raise my virtual hand as a host. Haven't been able to figure out anyways, but I was thinking if we had a standard that said your project can only occupy 50% of a lot, say, not impervious area, but the overall project footprint can only be 50% of a lot, and you need 20 acres of panels to make a viable 5 megawatt project, I think you'd see developers buying 40 acres instead of 20 acres just to meet that standard, and maybe taking more land out of whatever use it's in now. So just a comment.
Yep.
Good point.
So the other thing that I want to be conscious of, and I think this takes us to number 2 here, Ms. Norwood, is that lot coverage is only one piece of this puzzle. When we think about how much of the ag zone actually gets is open to solar development, solar power generation. So I'm happy to leave it as is personally, and but we might have to think about that in context with some of our later thinking about lot coverage or total land area and preserving prime soils. So any last comments on lot coverage? Okay.
So are we leaving it as is, or do we want to go in a different direction? I just want to.
So what I heard, and people can tell me I'm wrong if I misheard it, I heard people saying leaving it as is. Yes, Mr. Sear.
Yeah, with regard to the discussion, I can't remember. Are there any members of the public interested in speaking to this besides the gentleman who's involved in solar developments?
We did the required public notices, pushed it out on the website, and some outreach, and the only person on as a participant, as an attendee, is Henry Barrett right now for the solar ordinance.
I ask only as a point of order because it's a public hearing and not a workshop. Generally, we would take a staff report. We would ask questions and clarifications during the staff report, and then we would wait until after the public input before we start sort of deliberating what it is that we want. And that's just to give deference to the public that's present, although it seems there are none here. But
yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. So with that, we'll let staff continue, and then we'll circle back to this later.
Okay. So do you want me to continue going through them one by one, or do you want me to go through all of them and then?
I think it's fine to go through one by one so we can ask questions, and then.
Okay. All right. So the second discussion item are the total lot area standards. The Conservation Commission wanted to see the Ag Committee and the Conservation Commission themselves involved in project reviews. Some planning board members under this section also felt that the best ag soils shouldn't be considered for solar installations at all. And the board was hoping to hear from some ag zone landowners about what kinds of density would seem reasonable in the ag zone. We were hoping to have some at the hearing tonight, and maybe there'll be some at the city council hearings to voice their thoughts on what we have proposed here. We did add some language in the ordinance that the planning board has to request an assessment of the project by the Ag Committee and the Conservation Commission if it's in a resource protection district. Similar to the language that we have for subdivisions with the recreation and open space, where the board's required to solicit an opinion from the Parks and Rec Advisory Board on open space for subdivisions. It would be similar to that. And the planning board could decide to prohibit the use of prime soils entirely for soil or for solar, which is what some communities have done. But I thought that the planning board wanted there to be some sort of structure in the ordinance that would try and direct solar projects away from prime soils and not necessarily prohibit them entirely. And I thought we had achieved that by creating a lot more hoops for developers to have to jump through to put a solar project on prime farmland. And the ultimate decision as to whether or not a project can be sited on prime farmland is up to the planning board, with, of course, those recommendations from the Ag Committee and the Conservation Commission.
Okay, any questions for staff on this one? Yeah, Mr. Steer.
Yeah, I saw involving the Ag Committee and the Conservation Commission on the projects, and I think it certainly makes sense to ask, but it only makes sense to ask if we provide a clear directive as to what it is that we're looking for. So I would really like to see specific language as to what it is we want them to weigh in on. Only because when boards and committees are not given direction as to their work and what's being expected, you're liable to get anything and everything, pertinent comments that aren't pertinent, and I think it would help the Ag Committee and Conservation Commission to really focus on helping the board. The reason we would send it to them is because we're saying that we need, or we'd like some help, or we'd like some perspective, and it's important that we define what perspective and what kind of help we'd be looking for. So I would want to see specific language as to what exactly it is that
Okay.
we would want.
So we'll circle back to that point.
Yeah.
During our discussion. Yeah, Mr. Martelli.
I would like to also clarify the farmer, if he wants to put a solar panels on his property, he's not going to be, how should we call it? He wants to put it on that prime area because he doesn't want to, farm that corn anymore or whatever it is. He's not going to be reprimanded in some way. You know what I'm saying?
So just to clarify, you asking if this total land area would infringe on farmer choice and what he or she
Right.
chooses to do with his land, with their land?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
If it helps, the way that we have it phrased is we're just ensuring, it says the planning board shall consider other lands within the ag zone where solar energy systems have been constructed or received approvals, and must find that the proposed solar energy system will not materially alter the stability of the overall land use pattern of the ag zone. And then it asks for the opinion from the Ag Committee on that point, and it gets specific by saying that the overall effect of the existing and potential solar systems, if it will, one, be more difficult for existing farms in the area to continue operation due to diminished opportunities to expand, purchase, or lease farmland, acquire water rights, or if it will, number two, diminish the number of tracts or acreage in farm use in a manner that will destabilize the overall character of the surrounding area. So I think those are the two things that the planning board themselves would look at, and then also refer to the ag committee for an opinion if the solar project they feel will have one of those impacts. If that makes sense. Sorry, I'm reading a paragraph.
No, that helps. Thank you. Any more questions for staff regarding total land area? Okay, so we move on.
All right. The Conservation Commission was hoping for a minimum height limit as well as a maximum height limit, or they suggested one. I wouldn't say hoping. The planning board thought that height isn't necessarily the right metric to make sure that the ground underneath the solar panels is the same or better before the solar installation and after the solar installation. We cited in the staff report 3 sections of the ordinance that we thought achieved this. The first one requiring that solar projects keep with the existing contours. The second one is topsoil maintenance plan submission requirements. Third is a vegetative cover plan submission. Fourth, the critical wildlife surveys. And lastly, as part of the O&M plan, we'd also require a plan showing that they're prioritizing the ability to commingle agriculture and solar energy. So we thought that these standards attempt at least to protect the ground underneath the solar panels. I'm not sure if there's other standards that the planning board feels have been left out, or if that kind of gets into what we're trying to achieve with that.
Any questions for staff on this?
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Sear.
Megan, can you remind us? I apologize. I'm flipping back and forth through the draft, the 2 draft options. What specifically was said with regard to the wildlife?
Yes. Let me see. Says a survey of critical wildlife habitat is provided at the time of application if a project is located in an area determined to be essential habitat as defined by the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Agency approval shall be secured before a planning board ruling. And that's on, if you're looking at option 2, that's under number F, or letter F.
Okay. When you say agency approval, is that a state agency?
That's IF&W, yeah. It says as defined by the IF&W, then agency approval shall be secured. I can say IF&W again if.
I think that would be helpful. And so I guess my follow-up question is, we would essentially be saying that we're asking for a survey of critical wildlife habitat for areas that are deemed to be essential habitat by inland fisheries and wildlife. And inland fisheries and wildlife already requires some sort of approval to build in those areas. And so we're sort of like delegating that to inland fisheries and wildlife to determine whether or not that's reasonable.
Yeah, they for planning board subdivision projects, you'll see if you flip through some of those old packets, they've got letters from IF&W saying here's some critical habitat that we found on your site. Here's how we recommend you address this, and so it'll provide those recommendations to the planning board. Usually there's not any endangered species in the area that they're looking to develop, because they wouldn't bring it before the planning board if that popped up along the lines. But this would again require that because they're not technically subject to subdivision requirements.
So does the agency provide an approval, or do they're really providing feedback to the local planning board?
Yeah, it would be a letter or, saying what type of habitat is on the site and whether or not a solar project would impact it and what impacts that would have.
Okay, I guess when we come back to that, I guess I'd be interested in sort of rectifying the language there. Then, if it doesn't require an actual approval from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, it just requires that Inland Fisheries and Wildlife review the project and then provide recommendation, that our language sort of be rectified to reflect that, as opposed to an agency approval. But that was my question, just how that happened, how that worked.
Yeah, I'm gonna look back at the subdivision ordinance too, because I think I pulled that from there.
Megan, if you want me to open a different document, just let me know too.
All right, thanks.
Okay, are we ready to move on to clearing standards? Yep.
Okay. So the Conservation Commission wanted to make sure there was consistency with prime farmland versus forested areas in the decommissioning standards that we have. The planning board also wanted the ordinance left open to provide a mechanism to convert forest land to ag land after the life of a project, depending on the individual site. So we added some language requiring the decommissioning plan for the conversion of a parcel either into prime farmland or forest land, depending on what the situation is with the individual parcel. The Conservation Commission also wanted there to be the requirement about the critical wildlife survey. So we added that in there. And you'll notice we also talked about a Maine Audubon study, which had recommendations for protecting wildlife and habitat with solar projects. And our ordinance addresses each of those recommendations, and we went through those in the staff report. Planning board also wanted to see clearing standards to protect adjacent properties as well. So we updated the ordinance to also reflect that. And lastly, the planning board wanted some thoughts put into what do we not want to achieve with clearing standards. For example, do we want to see clearing for future residential development? So we're hopeful that the vegetative cover plan, the critical wildlife survey, decommissioning plan, all serve to kind of discourage these types of development from taking advantage of cleared land. And also anything over 5,000 square feet is required to be reviewed by the planning board as a special exception anyways. So hopefully during that process, any previous solar approvals would come up and the discussion would be well documented, hopefully. So the draft ordinance kind of opens up the door as well for the planning board to impose end of life conditions for solar projects. The tricky part will be making sure that staff follows up with those 20 years down the road. So.
Yeah, Mr. Sear.
I have a question for Eric and Megan regarding sort of the legality of something. So we use sunset clauses. Though I guess we don't use sunset clauses, but sunset clauses are used in other municipalities. And I'm thinking, is it legal for an ordinance to prohibit a specific type of use on a land for a certain period of time after a large event? So I guess what I'm thinking is it possible to have language that either prohibits single family dwellings or just residential units from being built on a parcel that was used for, in this case, a solar array for 5 years after the decommissioning of that solar array? Or is it possible to say that any construction of a residential dwelling would require additional steps to go before the planning board if they choose to do it within a set time, say 5 years of the decommissioning of that project? Is that something we can even legally do?
I've never run across a situation like that. If it's permitted in the zoning district itself, I don't know how we could prohibit them from someone from selling their parcel and changing the use. I don't know if Eric has any.
Well, I think the ag zone standards are probably the most stringent prohibition of single family homes in southern Maine. So there is a standard in place to make that difficult, but I guess if you came out of the solar project and truly had a farm that met the income standard, would you want to prohibit it at the end? If it was a farm that met the income standard.
So that actually gets to my question, which is related to this, which is what would we be trying to protect there? I guess because we have the ag zone ordinances in place anyway, we would be trying to prohibit, say, building a barn or someone who's a farmer being able to build a residence on that.
I think it may be helpful to make it clear that solar income does not constitute income for the purpose of building homes, if that's the goal.
Well, I guess I understood the concern to be that it would be possible for a solar developer to clear, say, 20 acres of land that was not previously cleared, and then upon decommissioning it, say, split that into two 10-acre lots. Or if the standards have changed within the next 20 to 25 years, which I assume they will, split it into whatever lot size for whatever use would be allowed at that time, and that it would be more beneficial because the land was cleared. I guess that was the concern I was hearing. Was I correct in hearing that, Megan? That was the concern?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, they didn't want to see the land cleared now, and then in the future, someone take advantage of that with a large development project that would be a lot more of an impact than a simple solar project.
So a question I would ask then is, in that scenario, were it possible to take a decommissioned solar project that's end of life, so 25 years from now, and if that gets redeveloped into homes because that's now allowed, if there wasn't a solar farm there, at what point would it have been redeveloped into homes without with the solar project never actually having existed? In other words, if you change the underlying ordinance and you have a piece of property that somebody wants to sell to create a development, there would be nothing to stop them doing that, right?
Yeah, if the ordinance is changed now to allow residential subdivisions in the ag zone, or somebody creates a building that's over 5,000 square feet, provided that's still a requirement, it'll still come before the planning board for review. But there's nothing that would prohibit them from doing that if it's allowed in the ordinance.
Right, Mr. Steer?
Yeah, I guess it seems to me like I understand the concern, and I asked the previous question just to see if there were sort of ways that we could address that concern. But honestly, I guess my question would be, would it really be gaming the system if you locked your land up for 20 to 25 years and couldn't use it for whatever development is allowed in the underlying zone? I mean, that wouldn't be gaming the system. That would almost be the opposite. If 10 years from now, the ag ordinance changed and you could build, 6 houses per acre, well, as the landowner with that solar development, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that for another 10 to 15 years until your land is decommissioned out of solar. So, yeah, as we're talking, it just seems, I understand the concern, and I was looking for ways to maybe address it, but after hearing Mr. Duval, I'm not sure it needs to be addressed. I think it addresses itself.
I think it's possible that the planning board and the council and the community through a public process could have determined that that area is where they need housing too, you know, if circumstances have changed.
Okay, any further questions on this? All right, can we move to prime soils?
I think that was prime. Was that clearing or prime soils?
I thought that was
Clear.
clearing, but it
Okay.
might have been the prime soils.
Okay, sorry. Nope, you're right. The Conservation Commission thought that prime soils should be prohibited entirely or discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Some of the planning board thought that prime soils could be allowed if certain needs are demonstrated, because it could preserve the land for the future if a property owner can't afford to farm it currently. The ordinance allows the use of prime farmland under 2 conditions and requires that the least productive agricultural soils be considered first. The planning board can also determine whether or not an application has adequately demonstrated that the least productive agricultural soils have been considered first. And as we discussed in the staff report, something that was interesting that we found is a lot of communities allow the use of prime soils as long as the applicants pay a tax penalty. I'm not sure this is the direction the city wants to go in. It would be similar to taking a property out of tree growth. So that's just something that we've seen a lot of other communities do to kind of address the use of prime soils. The planning board, another option could be to use the ordinance to put a cap on the amount of prime soils that can be occupied per site. So I guess this is kind of what we were getting at initially with the lot coverage standards. So for example, the planning board could say only 30% of prime soils on the entire site can be used for solar. So for example, if this site is 20 acres and only 5 acres of the site are prime soils, then only 30% of that 5 acres could be used for solar. Another option we found is what they're using in Connecticut. They're requiring that the city council, in this case, it could be the planning board, find that the project will have no adverse environmental effects, and that the State Department of Agriculture certify that the project will not materially affect the status of prime farmland. I don't believe our Department of Agriculture will issue a certification for projects like this, but I'm sure they would provide some sort of letter with their assessment of the project and the potential impact that it could have on the area. So by adding requirements like these, the ordinance is really making it more difficult to put solar projects on prime farmland. Not impossible, but definitely more difficult. So I think that's a way to kind of steer developers away from prime farmland, especially if there's other alternatives. But I'm happy to hear what the planning board thinks about those.
Yes, Mr. Sear.
Megan, did you find anything regarding forested versus non-forested land? I ask because I'm reading this section of prime soils. It's saying non-prime farmland is not available on the subject property.
I thought we were like that.
I guess I'm thinking. I'm trying to think. We have such a high percentage of forested area. It would be possible that you could have a lot that has, say, 30 acres. You could have a lot that has, say, 20 to 30 acres cleared, with another 40 acres that's forested. But because the 30 acres that's cleared just happens to be prime soil, would that require the developer to clear the wooded area the way it's written?
Potentially. I mean, I assume a wooded area is not prime farmland at the moment. It could be very well in the future.
Well, that's the kicker. It's not prime farmland. It's prime. It's prime soils, right? So there are people that farm, and their farm is not on a prime soil area. You know, none of their 30 acres is considered prime soil. So it's not talking about, when we say prime soil, we're not necessarily talking about land that's currently being farmed. Land that's currently being farmed doesn't necessarily have to qualify as a prime soil. But if the open land does qualify as prime soil, I guess my question is, would that require the developer to clear forested land if that forested land did not qualify? If that
Yeah.
was on the same lot.
Yeah, that wasn't the intention of it. I think we pulled this from another community that used this language to kind of deter people from developing on prime soils. But that certainly wasn't the intention of it, was to require them to clear land. So.
Okay.
I think most communities are in a much different spot too. There, with Auburn having 75% of their ag land forested and no housing pressure there. There's some logic to trying to clear some land for future agriculture as part of these soil projects that probably doesn't exist in more suburban communities.
Mr. Engler?
Thank you. So first off, I don't like the idea of using taxation as an economic incentive to try to penalize the developer for building on prime soils. Ultimately, you know, if they can make enough money building the solar project, then they'll just pay the tax and they'll do it. But if our public policy purpose is to preserve those prime soils for agricultural purposes, I don't know, the extra tax revenue raised, it just doesn't necessarily seem worth the trade-off. Another thing that bothers me about this is that ultimately, shouldn't Auburn be looking at this community-wide or ag zone-wide? And it really shouldn't be a function of the soil types on that particular parcel that's a candidate for development. I can see Mr. Sears' point that we can actually introduce a perverse incentive to go cut down some forests to change the ratios on the candidate plot. At the same time, I'm very interested in this notion that Mr. Sear developed last time, or introduced rather, about solar development as a mechanism to clear land. And so I agree that what is our concern here with the prime soil standard? Our concern is that we lose our prime soils farmland to solar development just because ultimately that can be more profitable on a financial basis. And so it seems like we want to allow solar development on prime soils if they're currently forested, because it could be a mechanism to remove the forest, and then ultimately use that land for agriculture later after the sunsetting of the solar development. It's the open land, right? So we should be really targeted in how we develop this mechanism. And I'm going to go back to my comment from last month, which is it would be helpful to see the overlay, frankly, because I still don't know how big an issue this is in Auburn. Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions regarding the prime soils section? Nope. All right, we'll move on to staff report about the OMP.
Okay. This one's just simple. The Conservation Commission was hoping to see standards that promote the commingling of agriculture and solar. We had information added into the ordinance that requires a plan that promotes the commingling of agriculture and solar as part of the O&M plan that gets submitted.
Any questions about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Sear.
It may be that I missed this previously. I'm reading under the operations and maintenance plans shall also include, and I'm looking at option number 2. It seems a little easier to sort of follow
Yeah.
what we're talking about in there. So I2, a plan that avoids the use of herbicides and other pesticides on the site to provide habitat for native plants and animals and native pollinators. So I have I have a question about intent, because as it's written, it says that you have to have a plan that says you are not going to use herbicides or other pesticides on the site in order to provide habitat for native plants and animals. But it reads like not so that you can't get rid of what's there in order to allow native stuff to come in. Was that the intent?
You're saying that's how it reads now.
Yeah, and maybe that's just me, but I'm just asking about what the intent is there.
The intent is after the project is operating is to make sure that they're not using herbicides and pesticides that are degrading the habitat that's there. Was the intent of it.
So maybe later we can talk about language to fix that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And I guess the second question would be, where did that come from? Only because again, maybe I missed it, but I don't remember seeing that previously.
Yeah, that was another one of the Conservation Commission recommendations. I think it was under critical wildlife habitat, and it was also in the Maine Audubon recommendations for how to protect property from solar development, and that was one of the recommendations that had come out of there as well. So it was just a way to address the Conservation Commission comments that they had on that.
And so final follow-up question. Our ordinances read, there's a clause such that if there's a conflict or question regarding two ordinances that seem to say something different, the more stringent will be applied. And would that mean that if a farmer was using herbicides, or if there was a farm plan to do hand-picked crops, that farmer would be required to do such without the use of regular agricultural herbicides and pesticides because of I2?
This would be just in relation to solar projects. You're talking about solar projects?
Right. So under I1, it says here there's a plan and that it prioritizes the ability to commingle agriculture and energy generation land to include apiaries, grazing, and hand-picked crops.
Mm-hmm.
Coming from a family that, I mean, I'm not a farmer, okay, but I've got lots of family that are. Number two, I2 would seem to imply that they couldn't use herbicides and pesticides that they might normally use in their regular farm operation if they were planting underneath the solar panels. So it's a question for you guys. It's a clarification question. I know that in our ordinance, when there seems to be a conflict, the way the ordinance is written is that the more stringent ordinance will apply. So in this case, the more stringent one would be a prohibition on the use of something, complete prohibition on the use of something. So does that mean that a farmer would not be able to use herbicides and pesticides, I guess, if they chose to in their farm plan grow crops underneath these panels?
Right, and it's not requiring that they not use herbicides and pesticides, I guess. It's not saying a plan that shall include not using herbicides and pesticides. It's just a plan that avoids the use of them. So if it happens to be that they need to use them, that would be something that the planning board would be reviewing as they look at the project.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Thank you. Any more questions about this aspect? Yes, sir.
I just grabbed the mapping for lot coverage or land cover in the ag zone if you guys want to see it. And I also have soils as well, if you guys want to see it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No.
I got one no.
Well, I guess since Mr. Engler brought it up, I would want to hear his justification for seeing it, and then that might sway my opinion.
It's because we're concerned about this loss of prime soils, and I know in the whole ag zone we did see overlays at different points in time, but I don't know how much prime soil there is. I'd be curious to know how much prime soil there is that's open versus forested, and I'm not sure if we can have access to that view. But I think there's this legitimate concern that it really wouldn't be in line with the purpose of the ag zone to just have the whole thing developed by a bunch of solar farms the next 5 to 10 years, because we thought that there wouldn't be that many, and then something changed sort of globally or macroeconomically, and all of a sudden there's lots, and we should think about this issue, but it should be informed by reality. That's all.
Based on Mr. Engler's comments, I'd be interested in seeing the maps.
Okay, Mr. Bergeron.
Yeah, I'd be interested in looking at them.
Okay, as I think I would. Question is, should we do that now during the staff report or later? Well, Eric's got it now, so.
What we're looking at right now is land cover. You can see, or I hope you can see on the left here, the legend. I can zoom out a bit, get a sense of the forested area, and we're looking at South Auburn right now. Really dominates the landscape.
Wow.
I can turn on the soils behind that, but I think it's going to be pretty busy. But we can switch between the two. I'll try it.
Maybe we can toggle.
So the prime soils do come through pretty well. There's off, prime soils on. They're quite limited as far as the overall geography. You can see these darker orange areas.
Am I muted right now?
No.
Well, thank you very much. That's exact. It seems like a relatively small issue, frankly, and therefore, I don't think that we should invest a whole lot of time discussing it. Probably.
And then the next level of very high quality but not prime are the soils of statewide significance, which occupy a much larger area. They're still very good soils, but they're not prime.
But those seem to be located much more in the forested area.
Most of them have reforested. Yeah. I think you can see that a lot of the larger areas of prime soils have been maintained as agricultural land because that was the most productive land. But there's certainly some exceptions that have reforested.
So it seemed to me that certainly less than 10% or even 5% of this section of the South Auburn Ag Zone that we're looking at would be both prime and open. Seems like a relatively small concern, and I'm not, now that I've seen this information, thanks Eric, I'm not as concerned as I was thinking.
Are we able to see North Auburn as well, please?
Sure.
And as he's moving the map, I can also say given what you say, Mr. Engler, that actually suggests there are multiple ways of handling the issue. Right? If it's not a big deal, you don't have to worry about it, or you could exclude it because there's not very much of it.
Sure, I agree.
So this is without the soil showing, just the land cover. And as we put on the zoning boundaries and prime soils, many of the prime soils are still where we have active agricultural uses because they've been the best soils to continue farming. But certainly some that have reverted back to forest
No one wants to farm on the island?
Mm.
Be careful on that island. There's a large goat and a large ram that roams out there all summer long.
All right.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. So staff, is there anything else in your report?
No, we just had miscellaneous recommendations that were made by the Conservation Commission, just making sure that the ordinance requires the solar projects comply with the state setback requirements. They were also hoping that the planning board would consider the big picture components of the solar projects. One of their recommendations was prioritizing rooftop solar, which I think we've already done by not really having any requirements to do a rooftop solar project in any of the zoning districts. So I think the planning board felt that the ordinance kind of already did that. So unless there's other miscellaneous items the planning board wanted to discuss, that was all that we had.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions for staff before we move on to the next part of our hearing? Okay, seeing none. So we have no applicant tonight. This would be the time when we would open this up for public comment. I would need a motion to do that.
So moved.
All right, Mr. Bergeron,
In favor.
Mr. Seer,
Yes.
Mr. Engler. I think
He
he's,
looks frozen.
yeah, we'll assume that's a yes. Mr. Martelli
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes. So at this time, anyone, any member of the public, Eric, you can see who's there.
Yeah, we have two members of the public. I know one of them is specifically interested in the backlots ordinance, and one of them is specifically interested in solar. So I can bring them both in if you want. I don't think it'd be overly cumbersome.
Yeah, I think we can bring them both in, and if they want to comment, they can state their name and address and address the board.
They're joining now.
Is that, it's two of them?
Yes, it should be Alan Kinnerson and Henry Barrett.
Yeah, good evening. This is Henry Barrett with Nexamp. Hopefully you guys can hear me, but I don't have any comment at the moment, but just really appreciate all of your work and the discussion tonight. So thank you for taking this project on.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kinnison, would you like to comment on this? I'm going with no.
All right.
Okay, so if there are no additional comments, then I need a motion to close.
So moved.
Motion to close.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Bergeron, Mr. Seer,
Yes.
Mr. Engler,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes. Okay, so planning board discussion. So I want to do a couple things to start off here. Rundown, as we ask questions of staff running through item by item, I think we ought to run through that way as well. So we'll just start off. We had actually already had kind of an extensive discussion of lot coverage. Any further comments on lot coverage at this point?
I have in my notes to leave it as is, but open to what the planning board wants to do with that.
Okay, does anyone have anything different they would like to consider in this area? Okay. Total land area. We had, I think, I heard an expressed desire to provide clear language directing the committees and commissions, if we're going to include that. And then we had a comment about constraining a farmer's choice regarding land use. So pick one. So Mr. Sear, you were the one that raised the question about the language and how the planning board and on what issues could direct the Agriculture Committee and the Conservation Commission. Is the language in the ordinance as it's currently written, is that sufficient for you?
I think it is. It gives direction. Unfortunately, it doesn't explicitly give direction. I don't know if that makes sense. And I'm going to look at option 2 only because I think it's easier to direct everyone to the language.
I agree.
So in option 2, it would be section, it'd be D, total land area. And in this paragraph, it describes what the planning board should be paying attention to. And then the very last sentence states the planning board shall request an assessment of the proposed project by the Agriculture Committee, and if located in the Resource Protection District, the Conservation Commission, and carefully consider their recommendations. So it's sort of implied there, but it's not particularly explicit that we want recommendations specific to the items discussed in that section D.
In that paragraph.
So just to make it simple, I would suggest an edit so that the sentence read, the planning board shall request an assessment of the proposed project based on section 60-145D by the Agriculture Committee and if located in. So just right there in that sentence saying, we're looking for a recommendation specific to what's in section D.
Yeah, so make it self-referential.
Yeah, I don't know how everyone feels about that, but.
Yeah, I was thinking one recommendation that I would have, that's a good way to do it. Maybe breaking it out into bullets or breaking it out into sub numbers instead of one big clunky paragraph. But that's an easier edit than breaking them out, so.
Any comments from the board on that proposed edit?
Makes sense.
Yeah, I actually quite like that. It's simple and it provides the direction that that sentence currently does not provide. So I understood your comment about it providing direction, but also not providing direction. So that fixes it to my mind. Any other issues regarding, I think, so I agree with Mr. Sears' thought to actually look at option 2 of the ordinance, because I agree. I think it's easy to get it all. I think, so Mr. Martelli, you were the one that brought up the issue of choice for the farmer. And I wonder if you could reiterate what that concern was?
Well, let's say the farmer is of age where he can't get out and farm every day. So this would allow him to make some money back so he could save his farm.
Yep. So, understood. That may come into play in a different part of the ordinance. I'm not certain it comes in assessing the total land area option of the ordinance.
That also could play out with a farmer that has a lot of machinery for packaging, and he needs that solar panels for the electric to run that machinery. So
Okay.
that would be the 2 points I'm concerned with.
Okay.
Megan, I think you structured it so if it's for consumption to power things on site, like a farmer's operation or a home, that it's not subject to all of these standards in the higher review.
Right, yeah, so the clunkier version of the ordinance has that information in it
Right.
under applicability. So it basically exempts those types of projects from this ordinance.
Right. And is that in option 2?
It's so option 2, the first standard requires that they comply with the provisions of Article 10, 15, 16, 18 of this chapter, which is the clunky version. So everything that's in the clunky version for the industrial district that's already been approved, adopted, would also apply for the ag zone.
Perfect. Okay. Mr. Bergeron.
I'm wondering if the and maybe this is the way it should be structured, but the first sentence could sound like an incentive for people to try to get in quick on it, because as more and more percentage of the agricultural land gets used for these kind of purposes, we reconsider every project as it goes. As the percentage goes up, they're less likely to get approved, I imagine. So it says, consider other lands within the agricultural and resource protection district where solar energy generating systems have been constructed or received planning board approvals, and must find the proposed solar energy systems will not materially alter the stability of the overall land use. That seems reasonable, actually. I like the wording of it, but I just don't know that would there be something to elongate the development of solar systems along a timeline, or is it just gonna the first come first serve kind of?
I would like to add a comment to that.
Yep.
So I guess honestly, Mr. Bergeron, when I read that was my first take on it until I read the sentence again, and it describes the overall land use pattern of the agriculture and resource protection district. So it's the entirety of the ag zone across the city, right? So if 20% goes into a solar farm, say in North Auburn, but South Auburn all remains doing what they're doing, one could make an argument that you didn't materially alter the entirety of the zone. And I guess also as I read that, I actually, it occurred to me, and I wasn't going to say it, but you have a concern about possibly limiting solar. The way it reads to me, actually, the more solar installations there are, the less an additional solar installation alters the current use of the zone. So I guess that's the way I read it, having.
Upon your interpretation of it, I see the word pattern actually does really change the meaning of it, because if the pattern is that there's more solar development, then it would be consistent with the pattern.
Yeah. I think you brought up a good point. It's the sort of thing we need to be looking at.
So, I mean, what this does is it gives a tremendous amount of leeway to the planning board in assessing what that overall pattern, with input from the Agriculture Committee and the Conservation Commission.
It does.
Yeah, I guess my concern is lessened by the interpretation. The word pattern actually does really kind of change the way I interpreted that.
Mr. Sear?
I think it only gives, it only provides the planning board with a fair amount of leeway if the planning board is able to draft facts, findings of fact that are reasonable, because the planning board can say, no, you can't, because we see this idea of like being inconsistent with the neighborhood. The planning board could find that there's an apartment building that we don't want, and we're saying that no, as a special exception, it's not allowed because, or as a site plan review, it's not allowed because it is, we believe, inconsistent with the neighborhood. We're allowed to do that. We're allowed to say that, and we can say no, so it's not approved. But if it was cited in between two apartment buildings, they're going to bring that to the Secretary of State, and it's not going to matter. That the planning board said no, because the findings of fact are not going to support the reality on the ground. So I hear what you're saying there, but I think it's tempered by the reality of having a check and balance at the state level.
Yep. Well, and I think in the end, it comes to trusting our structures to work.
Yep.
So, yes, Mr. Cousins.
I would just add that, circumstances do change over time, and the planning board, if they were seeing too many of these projects and really thought that was a problem, could recommend that the council amend the ordinance again to either further restrict or even prohibit new solar arrays if it became dominant in the ag zone.
Okay. Any more comments about this paragraph? Okay, so I think we have the edit from Mr. Sear. The next topic that we talked about was height, and really I think what this came to was the clause regarding the IF&W. When Mr. Sear brought up the issue of IF&W approval versus IF&W feedback, I wonder how people are feeling about that section, which is section F3 of the option 2. Mr. Sear, did you have language you wanted to propose?
I would strike the word approval. Well, I would add, after inland fisheries and wildlife, I would add, after the comma, I would write IFW agency, I just lost my word, not approval, but recommendation. I would strike the word approval and replace it with recommendation.
Okay.
And I would feel comfortable with that.
Thoughts and comments from other planning board members? Okay, that sounds right to me as well. So moving on to clearing. We talked about a lot in this section. There was the piece in there about decommissioning back to farmland or forest land as deemed appropriate. And then we talked about the future use and can we actually limit that. So I wonder if people have thoughts about, and where does this show up in So that would be F2. And maybe F4. Yes, Mr. Sear.
But as is written, I think F2 is fine. My concern is that as it reads, a decommissioning plan is provided at the time of application that includes a process and timeline for the conversion of the parcel into prime farmland or forest land as determined by the planning board. The cost of conservation of conversion shall be included in the financial surety to in accordance. We're talking about a 20 to 25 year timeline, and I worry that the choices we make now with regard to a property may not be the most appropriate choices for that parcel at the time of decommissioning. And I'm wondering if there's a way to add an additional review by the planning board that is currently sitting at the time of decommissioning, such that the decommissioning plan exists. There is a plan for decommissioning and conversion of the parcel. The cost of that planned conversion is included, but that that plan needs to be, I don't know, come before the planning board again.
You could add
a second approval.
Yeah, you could add a clause which said something to the effect of subject to the approval of the planning board at the time of decommissioning. Would that work for you?
Yeah, I think maybe if at the end we wrote, yeah, something like that. The
as determined by the planning board.
Such plan will be. What did you just say?
I said so. I would say as determined by the planning board and subject to review by the planning board at the time of decommissioning, or something like that. Or you could add another sentence. Either way would work.
I think tacking that onto that sentence, I would feel comfortable instead of saying at the time of decommissioning. I think we should put a time period, say like within 1 year prior to the date of decommissioning or something like that, to final decommissioning.
Yep.
Would you be open to qualifying that with something like as required by the ordinances at the time of decommissioning, something like that?
What do you mean?
So subject to review of the planning board as required by the ordinances at the time of decommissioning?
Oh, yes, at the time of decommissioning, you're right. Because that's the other concern, is that the future board could review it, but may be tied to using the standards we have now. We want to make sure that they have the ability to apply standards that are applicable at the time.
Yep. I like that. Any other comments on this part?
I have a question on the decommissioning plan and I've not been around for many of these yet, but the one that we saw on my first meeting, the proposed the reclamation costs or recycling costs of all the materials sounded like it would cover the cost of the cleanup. But I would imagine that in 25 years that technology is not as valuable as it is now. Those costs were based on current resale prices for those materials. And I don't think in 25 years, if there's someone decommissioning it, they're either letting go of the project and going back to ag, or they're going to a new technology and the resale value. So my question is about the decommissioning plan and the costs that are projected by their reclamation and resale value.
So my understanding, and staff can check me on this, is that we specifically state that any salvage is not to be included in or to be relied upon in the decommissioning, in the financial surety of the decommissioning. Is that right, Eric and Megan?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I don't think we mentioned anything about them being able to use salvage value in
No,
the.
I remember it was just in one of the presentations what their projected reclaim value was going to be, and I didn't know if that was anything that was relied upon, because as a decommissioning plan goes, you can't really project how much those are going to be worth in 25 years.
Right, we're just requiring that they provide an estimate of all of the costs that are associated with the removal, prepared by a qualified engineer, and that the amount include a mechanism for calculating the increased costs of removal due to inflation.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Prime soils. We had the issue around whether or not we would want to require clearing. We had questions about taxation, and I don't think that's in the ordinance as of now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I didn't put anything in there about the taxation. That was just something that came up in a lot of communities that I just wanted to mention. But I don't know if it would go beyond the planning board, and so it's up to the board if that's a recommendation that's made, but I just was throwing it out there.
Yep. So right now we have the two limitations on to help preserve prime soils. One is that there's no non-prime farmland available on the property. And the second is that the site is better suited to allow continuation of an existing commercial farm on the subject tract than other possible sites also located on the subject tract. So in other words, you can't pull up your corn to put in solar panels.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do people feel about this? G. Yes, Mr. Sear.
Well, I think this is probably getting at more to Mr. Martelli's point earlier in the meeting. And I guess in G1, where it says non-prime farmland is not available on the subject property, I would feel more comfortable saying something like non-prime land, prime farmland is not reasonably available on the subject property. I don't want to force, I know I'm the one that brought up the idea, the mechanism of using this as a way to clear forested land for future use in agriculture. But I also don't want to force a developer to have to clear forested land if it's unreasonable to do so. So I would like to see something instead of non-prime farmland is not available, something like is not reasonably available. And they would have to make the case for what's reasonable and what isn't. They'd have to sell the planning board on what that means. And I know that creates a gray area, but that's what I would feel more comfortable with. And I also worry about number two. I think about Mr. Engler's comment about, are we really thinking about prime soils? Are we thinking about open land? And in seeing that map, I think the open land, I guess is a little more important, but where it says the proposed site is better suited to allow continuation of an existing commercial farm on the subject tract than other possible sites also located on the subject tract. That means if you have cleared area, if you happen to own 40 acres and you've got 10 acres of it cleared, and you're farming that 10 acres, you can't use any of that 10 acres. You must use 30 acres of the forested land. And I think that goes to the point that Mr. Martelli was trying to make earlier. That really limits, that could possibly limit that individual's ability to make a deal with a solar developer. So I would like to see some kind of language in there that the proposed site is better suited to that, where it says the proposed site is better suited to allow continuation of existing commercial farm on the subject tract than other possible open area sites also located on the subject tract. And that's just my take. That and I'd be willing to bet that Mr. Martelli would want that entire language taken out so the farmer can do whatever they want anywhere they want. But
Well, let's hear from him. Mr.
Yep.
Martelli.
I agree with Evan. If the farmer is 60, 70, 80 years old and he's not able to farm anymore, physically, he's going to lose his farm. So by letting him have a solar panel farm, he's able to save his farm and still live there till he passes on, or until the solar farm is out of date.
So
I would.
So I understand exactly what you all are saying, and I'm sympathetic to it. One issue that then crops up for me, if we say that I've got 10 acres, I'm farming it, I don't want to farm it anymore, I'm going to put solar panels on it. My income is no longer derived from agricultural, from agriculture. So I no longer meet the ordinance for having a residence in the ag zone.
well, may I respond to that, Eric? I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is what I'll say to that, and this was part of the ag zone discussion, and it's that income requirement only applies to houses that were built after the adoption of the ordinance, the ag ordinance in, I believe it was 1964. And when you look at the houses in the ag zone, and Eric can correct me, but there may only be a couple dozen houses in the ag zone that actually, maybe less than that, it might be as low as 12 to 18, that actually have to meet that standard. If I were to live in a house that was built in 1963 or previous, and I stopped farming, there's no penalty. There's nothing to stop me from not farming now. If my house were built after the adoption of the ordinance in 1965, I must get planning board approval in order to stop farming the land, no matter what I'm doing with it. So, and I offer that just as a piece of information to say that someone quite literally couldn't just take their 10 acres and turn it into a solar farm if they were subject to the income requirement under the ordinance right now. But most people in the ag zone are not subject to the income requirements because their house was built prior to the adoption of the ordinance. Does that make sense?
Yep. It does. So what was your language again?
Instead of saying that non-prime farmland is not available, I would want it to say not reasonably available.
Yeah, I got that one. I meant on 2.
Oh, on 2. Second line, farm on the subject tract than other possible open area sites also located on the subject tract. I guess I would like to avoid requiring. I like the idea of it being a mechanism for clearing land, but I don't think it should require that land be cleared. Does that make sense?
Yep. So I'm wondering if there is a way to give the planning board some way to assess the viability of an existing commercial farm. So to create a little gray area in that line.
I mean, I think we could. We would have to rely on
the ag committee.
You know.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's something that would interest me in that. I can't come up with language right now. I don't know how others would feel about that.
I guess as I'm processing it, I'm thinking, for the same reason that I don't want to force a developer to clear forest land, even though I would like this to be used as a mechanism to add to the open space in the ag zone, right? So I think it's a good mechanism, but I don't want to force that. My reaction is that I don't want to prohibit someone from not using their land. Or that's not what I meant to say. I mean, I guess it's more like if we were, it almost reads such that if you can farm, you must farm.
Right, and we don't want. I agree. We don't want that. I guess if I step back a little bit and I think about the whole ordinance that we're proposing here, there are other parts of the ordinance that would allow the planning board to decide whether or not they thought this was an appropriate installation, right? In that letter D, in the total land area, they can make some calls about the pattern of agriculture, the pattern of land use in the agricultural resource and resource protection district. So I guess I would be okay with those edits that you proposed.
So I'm going to throw this out there. If that edit is made to G2, possible open area sites, and given that there are other mechanisms in other parts of the ordinance, do we need that sentence? Do we need G2? Yep.
I think you may have covered it elsewhere, and it does clean it up a lot to get rid of it.
Yeah.
It actually, that helps me a lot because it has nothing to do with prime soils either.
Yep.
That
Yeah,
sentence.
I would say strike G2 altogether.
Okay. The last issue that, if everybody's good with that, the last issue that I heard discussed was about the herbicides and pesticides. Again, this is number I2. It feels like there was a suggestion lurking out there to edit the language a little bit.
I'll address that one since that was one of my
Okay.
concerns. Having gotten clarification from staff and that it says the plan avoids the use of, so avoids is not a prohibition, and that if you are engaging in number one, you're doing some kind of farming, it is impossible to avoid that. That as long as it does not prohibit the use of those chemicals regularly used in agriculture, then I have no problem with it. So I'm gonna strike my previous concern after hearing from staff and their clarifications.
So that's fine. I wonder if simplifying that sentence to read a plan that preserves habitat for native plants and animals and native pollinators actually does all the work that we need it to do.
I think you're right. I think it probably does.
So we could scratch that avoids the use of herbicides and other pesticides on the site to provide. That
So-
actually is, that's a much more accessible thing too. The plan provides habitat.
Yeah.
Are there any more points of discussion on this ordinance? Hearing none, I'll be looking for a motion to send this to City Council. Mr. Sear.
Should we decide whether we prefer option one or option two?
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
I think that can probably be taken within the same motion, but whoever makes the motion should probably make note of that.
Yep, agreed. Do you have a recommendation? Or does anybody?
I like the simplicity of option two.
I agree with Steve. It's easier to follow.
Okay, does anybody disagree with that viewpoint? Nope. Okay, so motion. Mr. Sear.
Make a recommendation that we forward, I make a motion that we forward a recommendation for a zoning ordinance amendment allowing solar energy generating systems under special exception standards for the ag zone as drafted in ordinance format option 2 presented by staff at this meeting, and to include the edits discussed during the deliberation section of this meeting.
Second that.
We have a second.
Second it.
Second that.
Okay. Mr. Bergeron.
Aye.
Everybody.
So, Mr. Bergeron,
Yes.
Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Engler,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes.
And just real quick, we're hoping, well, not hoping, we're planning on getting this on the city council agenda for the 18th, which is
Monday.
Monday. So I'm going to get all of this information put together tomorrow and sent over to the planning board to take a look at. And I'm hoping that obviously I have to get this stuff sent over, but if we could have it looked over and the comments received by the end of the week, that would be really helpful. Monday's fine too. I just have to get the signed copy over to the city council. So
Okay.
end of week would be awesome, but understand it's a work week, so Monday's okay.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, next item on our agenda is regarding backlots. And this is not a public hearing, it's just a discussion. So with that, I think we'll just turn to staff.
Yeah, during the last discussion of a potential backlot ordinance, the planning board wanted some more neighborhood district specific examples of what a backlot ordinance could mean for the city, and maybe what some potential unintended consequences could be if it's applied to all residential zoning districts. So in the staff report this month, we summarized comments, questions in the beginning of the staff report that were raised by the planning board at the February meeting. And as we went through different examples of what a backlot ordinance could look like in certain districts and certain neighborhoods in the city, we kind of answered those questions, or provided comments on those questions, maybe not answers, but we had examples and then some possible solutions for the planning board to think about for each zoning district that we looked at. And just to summarize those, it seemed as though the urban residential zoning district is a good example of a district where a backlot ordinance would make a lot of sense with the least amount of unintended consequences. And the low density country residential zoning district, where there's a lot of those lots that are split between low density and the ag zone, we'd have to put some more thought into how the ordinance is written to avoid changing the makeup of some of those neighborhoods, because there's a lot of potential out there already to be able to split lots, and each of those splits could technically have a back lot. So it could completely change the makeup of those neighborhoods. And then there's neighborhoods, for example, the multifamily suburban neighborhood it has a low or a higher density, but it's sandwiched between low density in the ag zone, and it's very different from other parts of the multifamily suburban. So it's possible that allowing a backlot in the entire multifamily suburban zoning district could affect different neighborhoods differently, depending on what those neighborhoods look like. And I think, trying to think, hold on, what page? Sorry, I want to pull up the example that we have. It's on page 10 of the staff report. Where you can see that there's the land use pattern that's hard to see on this map. I know it was easier to see on the GIS, but the lots aren't as dense as they could be. And the area is surrounded by ag zone and low density country. So allowing backlots could really change the makeup of that neighborhood. That's just one example of where we could run into some of those unintended consequences. And then we have the multifamily urban zoning district, where you would want to encourage backlots, but there's no opportunities to encourage them because the district is already dense as it is. So one suggestion item to think about that we presented would be potentially density waivers or bonuses to encourage backlots in those areas. I'm not sure how effective those would be, but it's just something for the planning board to think about. Maybe we look into those. So we're hoping that our GIS consultant will be able to pull together a map of all of the lots in all residential districts in the city that could potentially have a back lot, so we can see what that would look like on an entire city map. The staff report pulled out several different neighborhoods within the city, but it would be awesome to see what kind of impact it could have across the city as a whole. So we're hoping to get that map for next month, but for this month anyways, we provided these neighborhood examples to kind of think about. And on the very last page of the staff report, pages 13 and 14 is where we went through a summary of all of the neighborhoods that we presented and some unintended consequences and potential solutions to address those unintended consequences. So I'm trying to think of the best way to kind of go through each of those. We could go through them one by one, or if the planning board's already had a chance to look at them and wants to provide feedback on some of those questions, solutions, that would be great too. So just let me know what way you want to go through it.
Okay, does anybody have a preference for how we go through these? So if nobody needs to go through one by one for all the examples, I guess I would focus, I would ask the planning board if they have any concerns about or thoughts on any of these models. And barring that, I would suggest that we go through the staff report and discuss their potential solutions.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. So with regards to neighborhood 1, which is low density country residential, staff has flagged that there are many lots that meet the requirements to split. And then those split lots could then be split once again. The issue being that you very quickly alter the neighborhood. One potential solution that they put forward that I think that of many that we could think about would be to prohibit further splitting as of some arbitrary date, say this month. Thoughts, comments?
And just a quick bit of information for the second page of the staff report. Just in that Perkins Ridge Road, we identified 17 parcels split between low density and ag. And of those 17, 8 of them couldn't split currently or take advantage of a back lot because they don't have the acreage or the lot depth to do that. 5 could split their lots now and create up to 10 additional single family lots. And then with a backlot provision, they could have technically up to 25 new single family lots. And then 4 couldn't split their lot currently, but could benefit from a backlot to gain 1 additional lot. So it has the possibility to really change the number of units that are in that neighborhood currently.
Okay. So, yeah, Mr. Sear.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the staff report, and I don't know how everyone else feels, but after having my primary thoughts were that this was not a great solution. And having read the staff report, I think this rabbit hole goes much deeper than we really want to go in order to create more housing opportunity by creating backlots. And I'm going to go back to my comment that I made when we were talking about this was, I think the better solution is to identify areas that the planning board feels already back up to higher density or are surrounded by a higher density, and look at rezoning in order to infill those areas. In looking at this, there are so many pitfalls throughout that the solutions are complex, and they require that we allow this neighborhood but not that neighborhood, and anytime we start having to get that complicated, I just get wary of the whole thing. So people aren't making many comments, and I assume that it's because they're maybe on board with the idea, but I think that we could have other mechanisms that would meet the same goal of increasing density without having to come up with complex and convoluted solutions to avoid negative impacts throughout the city. So. Before we get too far into this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because as I was thinking about that, you know, the idea of the map that Megan discussed, I think it would be useful and actually speaks somewhat to what you're talking about. It seems to me that this is not something we can just apply blanket across Auburn. I think this staff report actually makes that perfectly clear and requires maybe a different approach to trying to actually identify what the goal is, and creating backlots is not necessarily a great goal. The goal should, what is the higher level goal that's driving this particular ordinance question?
Yeah, and can staff actually remind us what's the origin of why this is before the board?
Yeah, unless Eric, I know Eric has been talking with a few different developers.
Yeah, it comes up as a question fairly often, multiple times, maybe a dozen times a year, where somebody is looking to add the ability to add a house lot to their parcel, whether that's for sale, for a family member. They exceed the density standards, or they exceed the minimum lot size requirements by at least double. So they have at least twice as much land area as the zoning would allow, but their sort of limiting factor is frontage. So we prohibit them from having a second house when the only thing limiting them, they have the required land area. The only thing limiting them is frontage. So the idea was to try to get closer to the density that the zoning allows, and not require the creation of new public roads. One way to do that a lot of communities have used has been backlots. As far as specific examples, almost every one of them is a single family home, with the exception of the one that I had mentioned on Witham Road that is a single family home and a disc golf course. But almost every single one of them has been a single family home looking to construct another single family home or residence on their parcel.
What was to go back to the disc golf course one, what's the problem with the frontage of that? Don't they have enough frontage to put another road in?
Yeah, so they have enough frontage to have the single family home and the disc golf course on a single parcel. The single family homeowner has developed the disc golf course over the years, is now looking to sell the house. The financial institutions that they're trying to use for financing won't finance a property with the disc golf course and a single family home on the same parcel as a residential mortgage. So what they're trying to do, they're trying to maintain ownership of the whole thing, buy the whole thing, continue to operate the disc golf course, live in the house, but they're trying to be able to make them two separate lots so there can be residential financing on the house that does not include the commercial disc golf course.
But the frontage and the access doesn't necessarily apply to that, or would it?
It's fine for the current situation where both uses are on a single lot, but it doesn't allow for a lot split because they have plenty of land area, but not enough frontage to split the lot.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
An alternative to that might be that was a planning board approved project. They could ask for some kind of a waiver if they could show that they meet the need for it, would meet the objectives and intent of site plan review.
And one other quick example that I had was our ordinance for residential zoning districts doesn't allow more than one principal structure on a lot. So we've been getting a lot of inquiries about putting tiny homes in people's backyards. And right now, a tiny home would be considered a second principal structure because it's habited. So they wouldn't be able to have tiny homes without a backlot provision or some sort of ordinance amendment to allow that.
Would a backlot ordinance allow that? I mean, you'd have to split the lot. And as I understand it, the majority of people that are looking to do that are not looking to do that to actually have two different lots. They definitely want the tiny house on their own lot.
Right. Yeah.
Lot.
That would be the only way that they would be allowed to do it right now, because they can't have more than one principal structure on their lot. So that would provide them, if they really want to do a tiny home, that would be the way that they would go about doing it if a backlot provision was allowed.
But Auburn doesn't have a tiny home ordinance either, which is
Correct.
I'm guessing there's a need to I know there's a need to develop lots of ordinances, but
That's on the list.
Yeah.
Tiny homes.
Yeah,
Another
we have a 700 square foot minimum for single family homes, which right now a tiny home would be a tiny single family home. So that would also need to be changed for small tiny homes.
So for me, I think I want to circle back to Mr. Sears' original point, which related to how we approach planning in this instance, which is what's the overall planning goal, not the actual anecdotal, like set of anecdotal requests. So it just strikes me, if we go by, well, we hear a number of requests for this and they're pretty common, that we ought to then think about, okay, what's a planning approach we can take that gets us the result that we want, rather than solving a few people's problem that creates a bunch of problems for other people, if that makes sense.
And I think we summarized that early on. The comprehensive plan suggests that we move towards more of a density-based zoning standard instead of a dimensional minimum width, minimum frontage standard. That we actually try to create a density that matches what the community has decided that they want. And where frontage is the limiting factor, we're unable to do that with a frontage requirement. And this is one kind of small step towards getting closer to the density that the community has set as a minimum lot size standard and not letting frontage get in the way of that. So I think there is a larger goal, as well as the goal of creating new housing opportunities in areas where housing is already allowed without creating new roads that cost money to maintain. So I think the instances that we mentioned kind of highlight that there is demand for this, but the overall planning goals are more that moving towards a density-based standard instead of a minimum width and depth standard.
I'd comment that if that's the overall goal, as a member of the board, I would much rather be presented with a set of solutions that the staff feel are viable, and if backlots are one of those solutions, that's fine. But I'm just not convinced that this is the only solution or is the best solution. And so it's sort of why I'm weary of continuing to trudge forward without sort of more clarity as to what the specific goal is. And if the goal is to increase density to better match the comp plan, I would want to know what are other mechanisms to do that, either in conjunction with or in lieu of the use of backlots.
Yeah, Eric.
I think this is one sort of incremental step towards that. I mean, the full-blown way to do it would be to throw out the frontage requirement and just go with a density standard. But I think that would be a much bigger step than allowing lots that exist as of a certain date to be able to create one additional lot. I think it would amplify some of the other concerns that we've talked about with the ability to maybe change the character of the neighborhood much faster than the backlots would.
So I have a question then. it's my understanding, I could be wrong, that the comprehensive plan focuses development from downtown out, right? So we want to develop closer to downtown before we develop further out. Is that correct?
It does, yep, with higher densities allowed in town.
Right. So I wonder if this is something that, so I guess I'm with Mr. Sear here I think in a sense that a plan that came up that sort of laid out the implications of this. So I think that map that you were talking about, Megan, is good to show that the implications of this sort of change, but also the implications of turning to a density-based standard, right? Is that something that gets applied only in certain zones? Is it something that gets applied closer to town rather than further out? I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is one option to move in that direction that is much more incremental than going to a full-blown, purely density-based standard.
It's incremental, but to Mr. Sear's original point, it creates a whole bunch of not systematic ad hoc solutions to problems that it creates. So it solves one problem, but it feels like it creates 5.
Yeah,
Well,
I think it's worth identifying those and seeing if they can be overcome, and if they can't, then the board should recommend that we not do this.
Question for staff, please. When we talked about the ag zone amendment, you guys had done report. Go ahead.
You just froze.
Oh, was I heard?
No.
No.
I'm going to resume. Am I heard now?
Yes.
Thank you. So when we went through the ag zone amendment process, staff had done a lot of analysis, and we could really, had concrete numbers about, the impacts and, potential lots open, that kind of thing. In this staff report, I'm seeing some, examples of looking at particular stretches, but have you done a municipal level review of how many lots could be opened by backlot? Because it looks like it could open a lot more potential new lots for development than the ag zone amendment.
Yeah, we haven't done these examples themselves took probably, I don't know, a week worth of work maybe to get all the math together and pull the neighborhoods and figure out so we haven't done a citywide one. I was hoping to have help from the GIS mapping to do that.
Because I guess my point is not what's the number. My point is, I seem to recall this number like 87. It was less than 100 new lots that would have been opened by even some of the more radical and less incremental proposed changes to the ag zone ordinance. And here it looks like we could be potentially opening up hundreds of new lots. So this is not inconsequential at all. I agree with Mr. Sear about that. I think that this needs to be, even though I think staff is responding to landowners and developers with this needs to be put back into a more comprehensive view with the comprehensive plan, because this is really big impacts, actually.
I think the ag zone lots are very large, and we don't have a data field that indicates frontage. So it has to be a lot by lot input of the frontage that each lot has in order to run the calculations on how many lots can be created. That would be much harder to do in the denser areas because there's so many lots. We had about a $50,000 budget for that study, and we'll try to do as much as we can for analysis, but I don't.
Well, I'm actually not suggesting staff do more work. I'm just saying that it looks like, maybe a few times more potential impact in terms of new lots to be open with potential to develop. in the
Well,
municipality.
I think it would be
Therefore, just considering all the effort and attention and stuff that we put in the ag zone amendment over a big fish here.
yeah. Oh, I think it's substantially more lots in the areas that we've designated as residential zones.
Okay.
And Eric, are many of them are further out, right?
Many of them certainly are. Yeah, there's a lower density standard out there, but we have like a rural residential or low density country residential has the 1 or 3 acres per lot standard that would still apply. Whereas in town, you could have a 10,000 square foot lot, a 1/4 acre in the multifamily urban, and potentially do a back lot.
Yeah.
Another option could be allowing a second primary structure on lots that meet certain requirements. So right now the ordinance doesn't allow them in any residential zoning district except I think multifamily urban.
I'd also like to kick in one thing on this, and that is that what Mr. Engler said earlier about the size of the home having to do with tiny houses. Just for a reference point, 700 square foot home is roughly 20 foot by 35 foot. And if somebody wanted to have a smaller home, you know, a tiny home, for mother-in-law or whatever else, we would have to also look at that for changing that scenario also. So that would be another option to look at with some of the denser areas, maybe.
As far as next steps, I think what I'm hearing is this is kind of a no-go without a pretty substantial effort on trying to collect data and create data that would quantify the number of parcels. And I do know that the number of parcels will be substantial compared to the ag zone because there's so many lots in the more urban areas and even in the rural areas in the residential portions that could potentially do a back lot. In order to kind of move this through the process, if it's something that the planning board's not supportive of, I don't want to spend a lot of time with the planning board on it. Do you think that we should work towards resolving some of those, or would you rather at the next meeting make a recommendation that you just don't support the idea, and that's fine?
Thoughts from members of the board? Mr.
Yeah,
Engler?
this is John. You know, I'm just thinking through different kind of situations and anecdotes, and I can appreciate why staff took it upon themselves to address this issue, because I can imagine some very sympathetic desires from landowners, especially when adding structures for family members. There's this issue that, you know, we might all kind of sign up with the idea of, oh, sure, we'll put a little house out back for mom or whoever, and then, you know, a few years later, property changes hands, and you know, so I don't want to sort of slam the door and say, hey, I'm not willing to listen to this, but as the staff report laid it out, this was too broad and it would have affected way too many properties, I thought. So if there's some kind of a narrower standard that would open up less backlots, or something more specific, I'd be willing to have that conversation. But as broad as it's been laid out here, yeah, I think seems like a bit of a no-go. That's my opinion.
I think we also have to develop a standard for the size of the home for that second building on that property.
Would that be something to exclude mini homes as their own, or, you know, tiny homes as their own thing, or would it be?
I would encourage tiny homes.
So what would the backlot standard for the floor print be then?
I wouldn't want the second home to be a mansion and the front home being a dilapidated, piece. That's all.
Mr. Sear?
Oh, yeah, I would echo what Mr. Engler was saying. This was incredibly broad, which is why I have such a tough time with it, and why I think there are so many unique, specific, individual solutions required to make it work citywide. The way it is, sort of as a broad paintbrush sort of deal, is sort of a no-go for me. But if we were to say, hold on to the comprehensive plan a little bit more and say, okay, we're doing this. The comprehensive plan is saying that we should be looking at density rather than street frontage, in conjunction with the concept that the comprehensive plan really emphasizes increasing density towards the core of the town, the city, versus the outskirts of the city. And we focused on for instance, looking at the downtown and then a specific radius beyond the identified downtown. And as I understand it, the city council has pretty much well defined what they believe the downtown is going to be when they look at development. We can take that as the core, decide on a certain radius beyond that, and say that's now going to be sort of the where we're implementing this density radius. I'm just really weary of allowing it to spread out all over town.
So I think what I'm hearing from the board is that the current proposal creates something that's far too broad, and that something that's more targeted and consistent with multiple aspects of the comprehensive plan would be preferred. I see nodding heads. Okay, so for next steps, I think that might be, so it may be possible for your GIS person to take that downtown core and then with the map that you were talking about, create that downtown core and then create some buffers of certain distance, 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters, whatever around that downtown core, take a bunch of them to map out the effects or the potential areas of impact that we're talking about.
Yeah, that starts to narrow down the amount of data that we need to create too, so that'll be helpful.
Exactly.
Definitely.
So with that, I would say there's definitely no chance that we would be ready for a public hearing in June. So we'll bring back some more information to you and then see where it goes from there.
I think, what do members of the board think?
Sounds good.
Yep.
We still have, looks like we still have one member of the public on as an attendee, and it's Alan Kinnerson, the potential resident that was looking at the disc golf course on Witham Road.
Okay, well, with that, I'm also conscious of the time. It's beyond 9. The 2 topics remaining are public comment and miscellaneous items. I would need a motion to continue.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Bergeron,
I'll hear it's about the backlot. I'll hear that.
Mr. Sear,
Yes.
Mr. Engler,
Yes.
Mr. Martelli,
Yes.
and Chairman Duval.
Yes.
Well, I make a motion to hear the public.
I think that was a motion to open public comment.
I'll second that. Actually, I'm not sure we need a motion. So this is just
It's
the
one.
workshop.
Yes.
Let him be heard.
No, this is the official public comment section.
Yeah, not a required public hearing, but certainly a chance to hear from the public.
Yep.
Hi, this is Alan Kennerson. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I lost the video about an hour ago, so I've been in the dark here, but I appreciate all that you're doing to try to do what's best for the city, and I totally respect where you're coming from. I don't know if there's a chance on my end, my little world here of trying to purchase this disc golf course and have a nice home on this 25-acre lot. We wanted to split off 4 to 5 acres so we could get it approved through the financing institution. And we have no desire of splitting property in the future. It's just the road frontage does not allow us to have this right of way through the business that the course is on the road side of it. But I don't know if there's any way I could be heard and put in I don't know how these things work, but if there's a way I could present the situation, I would certainly appreciate any consideration you would give it. This has been going on since November. We've been trying to do this. The owner is anxious. We are starting to look in other towns to do this, and he's stuck and I'm stuck. So I know that's just one little thing, and you've got so many big things to do. I've been sitting listening 3 hours of very interesting conversation here, but I don't know if I could possibly be heard or present something without too much expense to possibly have some consideration for letting us go forward with this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Engler.
Question for staff following up on his comment. Now, this is exactly what I was referring to sometimes, and I don't know the details of this situation, but sometimes there's specific situations. It's like, geez, can't we just let this person do what they want to do? Could this person apply for a special waiver in their circumstance, Eric? And are you familiar enough with the case to determine that for us?
Yeah, I think in general, we'd have to see an actual application. The only possible path would be a waiver of dimensional standards for frontage for them. And the only way that the planning board can do that is if the waiver is necessary to meet the objectives and intent of site plan review. We'd really have to look at whether or not, between the comprehensive plan and the ordinance, the only thing I can think of would be that there are clear goals laid out to encourage recreational uses. They're not intending to increase the density of housing or even change anything visually on the landscape, but they need this separate collateral for the loan to go through, basically. So if we were trying to encourage that, maybe there's a path to straight face that under site plan special exception, because the disc golf course is a site plan special exception approval that was granted a number of years ago, and maybe they could amend it to draw a lot line. It's not bulletproof, but it's probably a possibility.
Eric, I've been out to the disc golf place, and I've played out there several times. And I know you have that long driveway out to the house on one side and then the golf course on the other side. And I don't see any reason why there couldn't be a special variance made for this gentleman so that he can get this home. He's not going to split the property, he says. So why not help him and help, the neighborhood?
No, I think everybody wants to try to facilitate that, and it's a great recreational asset to the community. It meets the goals of the strategic plan and the comp plan and bringing people here to have fun and be outdoors. It's just the legal path. If there's a way to do the modification, there might be a path there. If it's a variance, he would never meet the standard with this request. So
I recommend that we give him a variance of some sort.
the modification of the frontage might be a path, though, if the board was open to looking at that.
Mr. Bergeron?
That would have been my recommendation too, is some sort of exception, because like you said, the recreation part of the comprehensive plan, that's something that's accomplished by this. I've also played there. It really is. The property's out back and the course is on the other side. I would have a question about, with the exception, who is, well, I guess if he's a primary property owner, he'd be in charge of the whole right of way as far as clearing in the winter or whatever goes. But it seems like this is more of a, in my opinion, more of a place to look for an exemption than it is to look for a rule, because it's a pretty unique circumstance, in my opinion.
And accommodating it hits on a lot of city goals, making it possible. They would be having tournaments and improving the course over time and bringing people to our community.
I would recommend a couple improvements to the course. That's a personal thing.
So I guess one other comment I would make for staff is, you guys might have some other specific cases in your minds that were a big part of the sort of reason that we're having this conversation tonight. So if we do talk about it again as planning board, grounding the conversation in some of those particular cases and seeing how the changes that we're proposing would affect them, and maybe not sort of throw open the gate to all this other stuff that we're concerned about.
I would say I agree with Mr. Engler, as long as we're applying it to some principle-based proposals. So, right, rather than having the anecdotes drive the policy, think about what our principles are, what would be a good policy, and then seeing how it would affect those particular examples, if that makes sense. Any more thoughts on all this? So wait, Eric, did I hear, were you posing a question to us about this particular instance, or that would be something that you would need to explore offline with the landowner before you were posing a question to us?
I think that it is a stretch of that authority, but I don't think it's impossible. So I think we could look at it outside of this process, but if the board really wanted to try to accommodate it, I think they probably could, and we can verify that legally.
So that would be something that you would bring to us?
If there's a desire on the part of the board to try to find a path to this, to solve this problem. So.
Okay.
Because it is a stretch of that authority to apply it in this way, but I don't think it's out of the question.
Evan, you're muted.
I have a question for staff. So I just looked at the parcel in question using the city's ArcGIS, as well as reference chapter 60 of the ordinance online. It appears the parcel is entirely in the low country residential, and that requires a 320 or 300 foot width or 320 foot width of lot, but it says nothing about frontage. I ask only because it occurs to me that within the fairly recent, I want to say 3 to 4 years, we saw some lots that were fairly oddly shaped. The planning board had some concerns about it. Staff explained that the way that lot width is measured, and that it was not the frontage that was required, it was the lot width that was required. And so I'm wondering why, if maybe I'm mistaken in my memory, but why we're applying a strict road frontage requirement to a lot when the ordinance for that zone references a lot width, not a road frontage.
Yeah, the width is measured at the front setback line. In the case of their particular lot, they have frontage in 2 places in a way that we wouldn't allow today, but it exists as an existing lot. And the frontage can be less than the width as long as the width is met at the front setback line.
I seem to remember a lot on Woodbury that it was like it wasn't about the frontage or the front setback. It was about something about measuring. I don't remember, but it was a really funky way to measure it, and it
We could look at it. I know there are exceptions on cul-de-sacs and corners as well.
okay. Yeah, that lot was definitely on a corner. So
This is neither a cul-de-sac. This particular our public comment. We started this with a public comment. And the gentleman who's here to public comment. This particular thing's not on a cul-de-sac, or this seems like it would be an easy exception and not something that we should make a rule about because it's this kind of unique situation.
I agree with Mr. Bergeron.
So we have two members of the board who would be interested in exploring this particular instance more deeply. Are there?
Yes.
How's the rest of the board feel?
yeah, I'd be willing to look at solutions, only because the shape of this lot is not unique in that area to have had a house lot carved off sort of right in the middle of the frontage that splits up the lot. If that other house weren't there, the lot itself would certainly be wide enough and there'd be no question. So I'd be interested in trying to find a solution for this specific lot because it would apply to other lots as well.
Okay. Mr. Angler?
Well, I don't know that I'm sorry. I don't know that it would apply to other lots though, because this is a particular situation where the bank is the one who's inhibiting the sale of the lot because they don't want to, because some of it is commercial and some of it's residential. I don't know how many other lots have that unique.
I hear you. I guess the idea though is that when we do something, it's never for one singular lot. It's always how it will affect all the other similar lots like that in the city. And in this case, it comes down to financing. But it's not our business to rectify an individual's financing as the planning board. That's really not our business and beyond the scope, and almost, I would hazard to say inappropriate for us to venture into. However, if there are lots that are wide enough to have met the road frontage, but because there's a lot that breaks up their road frontage, that's certainly worth something. That's certainly worth looking at because there are several lots that would fall into that category in the city. So it would certainly solve his problem if we were to find a solution for those type of lots. But in my opinion, it would really be looking at how we affect those lots and allow them to really take advantage of their full lot width, despite having a diminished frontage, rather than worrying about the financing that this individual's dealing with.
And this is but just one example, really the minority of the examples of why we were pushing for the backlots. The backlots was comp plan driven, but it solved this problem as well as other property owner desires. So I don't want the board to think that we were driving this for the disc golf course, because it really, they have an urgent matter with their financing, but it's much broader than that. It's not being driven by this project.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Angler, how are you inclined toward considering this issue of an example of which is...
I think that in the case of the disc golf course, it's just one landowner looking for a solution to their problem. I think they're going to have to work with staff, and if staff thinks there's a need to amend ordinance, then staff can bring that suggestion forward to the board. I think we've been pretty clear that we're concerned about doing something too broad brush on this issue. And then multiple of us have mentioned that we should make sure that we're being driven by, the public planning interests and not the private interests of anecdotal landowners. So I guess that's my view. And if staff wishes to bring this back to the planning board, then we will hear it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So is that, staff, is that enough for you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So final item tonight, we can probably do very quickly. We have upcoming.
Yeah, so in June, you'll see Mystique Way again. You just approved them last month for the addition of a few buildings out there. They're looking to create a subdivision out of those buildings. So they've laid them out in a way that they can do that. So you'll see that plan next month. You'll see Future Guard at 101 Merrill Road again. They want to do another factory expansion. And I'm guessing you're going to see Nexamp, the solar project out on Riverside Drive, that would be in the ag zone. So they've already submitted an application to meet the deadline for that. But obviously we haven't been able to tell them for sure that they'll be on the agenda until the ordinance gets approved by City Council. So you'll be testing out your new ordinance next month. So.
Okay. Great, thank you. Any other things planning board members want to bring forward? I do have one. I would like the planning board to send a letter to City Council. It sounds like they want to address the comp plan, but I would like to send a letter urging them to send a comp plan, or urging them to update the zoning so that it matches the comp plan as part of their comprehensive plan update. So if we can put that on a future agenda where we can talk about what that would look like, I'd appreciate it.
Councilor Boss advocated for that at the council meeting as well. So I think, you know, your thoughts being consistent with hers would help drive that point home.
Okay, so yeah, that would just be a future agenda item for me.
Yeah, it's been an issue ever since I joined the board, and I joined the board, you know, right after this last one was really adopted. I think it's a great future agenda item, and full disclosure, when we discuss it, I'm going to push not that we just send a letter, but that we advocate changing ordinance to actually require that Chapter 60 be amended within a specific time frame after the adoption of any changes to future land use.
I'm totally down with that.
To force the issue, so that way either we choose zones that we want in the future land use and we actually change them to that, or
we don't. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that was an issue before the adoption of the current plan too. So it would be nice to, out of the gate, with the exception of the transitional zones that have a trigger, to get them consistent right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Yep.
Quick, is this Future Guard's third expansion? This is like their third expansion in 5 years, huh?
Yeah, there's been a lot. Administrative, planning board.
Yeah, they're doing really well.
They keep changing too. Their ownership is he responds to stimulus and opportunities and changes on a dime. So they've been very successful, and they've just purchased a Canadian company that builds a lot of awnings and Florida rooms, as they call them, to attach to your mobiles in Florida.
Okay, with that, you know what I'm looking for.
Motion to adjourn.
Is that a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.